Hello, everyone. This is Admiral Jamie Fogo from the Center for Maritime Strategy at the Navy League of the United States, just outside Washington, D.C. You're listening to Maritime Nation, the Center for Maritime Strategy's podcast designed to dive deeply into the policy challenges facing America's sea services and the role of the United States as a sea power on the global stage. We aim to provide you with the highest quality analysis on the most pressing maritime security challenges by joining in conversation with key experts and practitioners. This season's podcast is produced with support from Data Miner is recognized as one of the world's leading AI businesses. The company's clients are the first to know about high-impact events and emerging risks so they can mitigate and manage crises more effectively. Data miner solutions are relied on 24/7 by hundreds of clients, including the Department of Defense, in over 100 countries across 6 continents to help them solve real-world problems. While in uniform, I relied on Data Miner First Alert for situational awareness within the ever-expanding publicly available information space. Now today, we're joined by my good friend and colleague, Mr. Jim McCarthy of Cypress International, for a timely conversation on breaking down the defense budget as we approach the fiscal 2025 presidential budget request. In our last episode of Maritime Nation, we sat down with Generals Kremenetsky of Ukraine and Fuller to discuss how the war in Ukraine has progressed and what lies ahead for the Ukrainian armed forces. Naturally, that conversation addressed American support for the war effort and the U.S. congressional support needed to sustain Ukraine's fight. Today, we'll get a chance not just to address American defense spending in support of Ukraine, Israel, and allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, but the broader landscape of what to expect from defense spending in 2025 and impacts on our sea services. In the Office of Management and Budget Personnel's 2024 budget request, the White House stated and called for the following, I quote, "Maintaining U.S. naval power is critical to reassuring allies and deterring potential adversaries. The budget proposes executable and responsible investments in the U.S. Navy's fleets." The budget also continues the recapitalization of the nation's strategic ballistic missile submarine fleet while investing in the submarine industrial base, something near and dear to my heart as a submariner. In addition, the budget makes meaningful investments in improving the lethality and survivability of the fleet, particularly in improving undersea superiority. In the coming weeks, the fiscal year 2025 national defense budget is expected to be presented as part of the fiscal 2025 presidential budget request. At the same time, last year's budget has still not been passed, and the Department of Defense is operating on a continuing resolution. We have seen the Pentagon's Sabrina Singh, spokesperson, discuss continuing resolution's impact on defense modernization and industry at the podium. Today, we'll address some of the CR concerns on the program. Now, before we dive in, we have 2 matters to cover. First of all, let me tell you a little bit about this episode's featured guests. Jim McCarthy is a distinguished retired naval officer and public servant. I will not cover his extensive CV, but let me share a few highlights for you. Jim is the former Assistant Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Integration of Capabilities and Resources on the staff of the Chief of Naval Operations. His mission was to exercise centralized supervision of Navy warfare requirements, allocation of resources, program planning, study efforts, and ensure the integration of planning, programming, budgeting, and assessments within OPNAV and the management echelons subordinate to the Chief of Naval Operations. Mr. McCarthy managed the development of the Navy's Program Objective Memorandum, the POM, with annual total obligation authority, or TOA, exceeding $130 billion to deliver a fiscally balanced annual budget with increased capability and capacity for the Chief of Naval Operations and combatant commanders worldwide. Jim entered the senior executive service in January 2007 after 28 years as a Navy nuclear-trained surface warfare officer, serving from 1979 to 2007. He retired from active duty as a captain. His first SES assignment was as the Deputy Director for Warfare Integration on the staff of the Chief of Naval Operations from January 2007 to December 2009. He was responsible for management of the process that supported assessment of relative warfighting systems, investment priorities, and developed the Navy shipbuilding plan and integrated the overall warfighting procurement budgets from the various individual warfighting sponsors. In addition, Jim and his staff supervised and resourced the Navy's in-service ship disposition process and provided the Congress with the Navy's long-range shipbuilding plan, supporting ship procurement through the next 30 years. Jim has extensive experience with ballistic missile defense, NATO defense spending, theater, air, and missile defense, and he holds degrees from Purdue University and the Air War College at Maxwell. Jim, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Look forward to doing this.
Absolutely. Now, our final order of business before we get to some questions and deep diving into the budget is our naval term for this month's podcast. So many of you who listen to the podcast know that we kind of start out with a naval term from the Naval Terms Dictionary. That's a little harder when you're talking about budget. There's not a lot of terms in the Naval Terms Dictionary that I picked up as a plebe at the Naval Academy that talks about budget. So our term today is about budget, doesn't come from the dictionary, but it's the gold watch. So not specifically a naval term, but one I've seen used and used by Mr. McCarthy in the PPBE process for many, many years. It means to answer a budget cut proposal by selecting for elimination a program so important and valued, a gold watch, in other words, that the CNO knows that political leaders will restore funding. And the aircraft carrier is often used as a gold watch, or as Jim pointed out earlier, a platinum watch. So we're going to start off with a few rapid fire questions just to kind of get everybody up to speed on the budget and the budgeting process. And then we'll get into some esoteric questions about particular platforms and programs and how much they cost. But first of all, Jim, as a surface warfare officer, what catalyst caused you to go from being a nuke into the financial management side of the Navy? Over to you.
Yes, thanks for the question. My first tour in the Pentagon, I was a lieutenant, and by happenstance, I was assigned to then Up 09, which was the one of the resourcing divisions. I was in Up 90, and my desk was right outside the branch head's office. The guy that was doing the job was then Captain Don Pilling, who later became Vice Chief of Naval Operations.
The great Don Pilling.
Yeah. And I watched what he was doing at it. Well, that's really cool. I'd like to do that job someday. Careful what you ask for. And I was working on an MBA anyway. I already had a technical degree, and I was doing the night school thing for my master's degree. And I focused the MBA on financial management. So when I left Up 80 at that time, the code had been changed. I left with a financial management subspecialty, and so no good deed goes unpunished. Every time I went to shore duty after that, I got to go back to the Pentagon and work on a budget, and so I've done lots of budget work in Navy and the OSD staff.
Yeah, that sounds great. And being inspired by Aral Don Pilling, I got to tell you a quick story, and I don't think I've told you this one before, Jim, but the audience will enjoy it. Admiral Pilling had his own running group. And I used to get in the Pentagon pretty early, but not as early as him. So they were usually coming in as I was arriving at about 0600 in the morning to start my day of all the different jobs I had in the Pentagon. And just before he went out to Sixth Fleet to take command, his guys wanted to give him a little bit of a going away party. They always used to have breakfast in the old POAC, which had a little grill, and they'd run, they'd come back, they'd get showered, they'd have breakfast, they'd go about their duties. So Admiral Pilling kind of made it fun for his team. There were a lot of guys. So one day they observed the there was an Army general out running, and he had a couple of people that were running with him, and they were carrying flashlights. So it was dark in the morning. There's a lot of traffic out there. They don't have the safety precautions that they have now as you cross the parkway and everything else with the lights going off. So these guys were just kind of flashing the lights to look at the way ahead and make sure that there was no traffic and no obstacles in the way. And Admiral Pilling thought that was dumb. He didn't want any flashlights. So on the last day, I think before he departed, all of his guys got together because he was Navy. They got red and green flashlights for port and starboard and surprised him. And he was highly nonplussed by that. But they went out and they ran around with their red and green flashlights and came in, and they were very proud of themselves. So I do remember him. He was a great friend of Admiral Mullen and a great mind. And we sadly lost him a few years ago to cancer.
Yeah, if I was sitting at my desk, because I was right outside his door, if he saw me sitting there, apparently not doing anything, he had a doctorate in mathematics.
Yeah.
He knew I was a nuke. So he'd come out the chalkboard and write a problem and say, well, if you're not doing anything, solve that.
That's outstanding. That's the kind of relationship you want to have with your boss, right? And
Yep.
humor and good connectivity. Well, so you were at N8 and I was at N8. I was in N81 and I learned from the master. You're the master Jedi. Your title was N8B. What's significant about that?
Yeah, so you're the continuity it's for those who are not familiar with Napoleonic codes, the N8 is the chief financial officer for the Navy. And the N8B is the deputy chief financial officer, essentially. And you're the continuity that carries over what did we do, why did we do it, what's the long-term impact of the decision's going to be, and to be able to provide advice and counsel to the guy that's going to be the N8, the guy or the gal. And because you've been there longer than most of the guys who are in the N8 role, you can often see second and third order impacts that might not be obvious to them just because they don't have the experience you do. And so that's, really the function of the N8B is really to maintain the continuity, and then to see the second and third order impacts down the road of decisions you make today, and make sure that senior leaders understand that and don't, head off on a path with an unintended consequence.
Yeah, I think that's really important because as the B, not only were you the overlord of the budget, but you were also a role model for the other senior civilians and junior civilians that were in the organization. There were a lot, and you trained up pretty much every N8 that I knew. I mean, Terry Blake was there when I got there. Matt Al Myers came in. Joe Malloy. Those are some incredible personalities and characters that you had an opportunity to work with, and you did all that in the POM. And we talked about POM stands for Program Objective Memorandum. It's part of PPB&E, Planning, Programming, Budget, and Execution. How many POMs have you done as a financial manager?
27.
Oh my God. Yeah. I think you might have even beat Trip Barber's record on that. I don't know if Trip had 26. Yeah. He'll remind me if after this podcast is over when he hears it.
Yeah.
But, what's it mean when you enter the budget season? I mean, are there seasons to the budget? Is it ever over?
Yeah, it's never over. But there's time when we talk about the budget season. What we're really talking about is the period between when you submit the president's budget to the Hill, which is supposed to be the first Monday in February, and that kicks off all the posture hearings and all the deep dives by the Congress and rest of that, with the objective, and I underline that word, of having a budget passed by the 1st of October so that you can start the fiscal year on a new budget. And there's a pretty intense process between budget submission and when Congress is supposed to have passed the budget. And so when people talk to budget season, that's really the period they're talking about. But, as a practical matter, we're on a CR today still for 24.
Yeah.
So, and 25 was wrapped up at the end of last year. It's ready to submit to Congress. It's going to go over on the 11th of March now. So it's going to be a couple of months late getting to Congress. And the services right now are actually working on the 26 budget in the planning and programming process. So, the budget seasons tend to overlap one another a little bit, and when we go on to CRs and that sort of thing, they overlap even further. So it loses some of its meaning in terms of a specific point in time in the on the calendar. So
Yeah. Well, we'll talk a little bit in a minute about the perils of a continuing resolution, but I want to go back to you and I were at the Surface Navy Symposium, in SNA. I really enjoyed it. I've been a couple of years now since I've been in this job because we try to be non-parochial and spread our wings at the Center for Maritime Strategy around all the sea services. And so Admiral Franchetti gave a speech with her vision statement. I know you were there and you heard it. And she talked about warfighters, warfighting, and the foundation. And I like that because it was reminiscent of what we did with Admiral Greenert. That was 3 tenets, 6 words. Warfighting first, operate forward, be ready. And we lived by that in the Pentagon. It was easy for sailors, officers, chiefs to remember, kind of gave us, a bit of a theme as we move forward. So what'd you think of all that? What'd you think of the speech? And do you think that that helps us as we move forward in a budgeting process? In other words, warfighting and warfighters is what it's all about.
yeah, no, I think you're spot on. And I thought her speech was very good. Frankly, we can all argue about nits during anybody's speech, but the argument to put warfighting first, warfighters second, and foundation, the way that she characterized that was the ability to execute the mission is first. The people that support that and making sure you have the right capabilities in place to be able to do your mission. Certainly next to most important objective. And then the trucks that take us to the fight, ships, airplanes, submarines, that's the foundational stuff. And I think that's the right priority. And I was nervous that because she'd been vice chief, that when she took over from Admiral Gilday, that she was going to look at, take his vision and just sort of polish it a little bit, around the edges. And the thing I think that the big difference between where Admiral Franchetti is and where Admiral Gilday were, when Gilday came in, he was, 8, 9 years away from the Davidson window. So you could worry about things like, ships being built today and the rest of all that. She's coming in at a point where the Davidson window is 3 years away. Building a ship today is irrelevant. It's going to deliver after the. So focusing on take what you got, make it better, make it more effective, make it more capable and lethal, and then having the right people on there to be able to execute that mission, I think clearly needs to be the focus of the Navy. Her message was clear. I'm sure that the troops are going to understand it, and that's going to be that's the important piece of the message she put out. And it was very short and sweet and clear.
Yeah, and I particularly liked the piece about the foundation. As you said, trucks, the vehicles that take us to the fight, whether that's an amphibious ship, a submarine, an aircraft, et cetera. That's important. But also part of the foundation is the shore establishment, which, as you know, as a budgeteer, is always disenfranchised. And my great friend, Vice Admiral Rick Williamson, just retired from the N4 job. Ricky was my CNIC guy over in Naples, Italy, and he kept the shore infrastructure over there going. And there's so many bases in places, just hugely challenging. And he also had part of the Middle East, just did a great job, which is why he became the N4, got a 3rd star. Ricky's actually, I think, more than just thinking about it. He's embarked on a project to write a book about the shore. So we have Command at Sea, that has the big pin on it. I think Ricky would love to do something about the shore establishment with the Shore Command pin and let everybody know how important that is. And that's part of Admiral Franchetti's foundation, and I was very pleased to see her put the spotlight on that. Okay, we'll shift gears and we'll get into some harder questions. So just talked about the CNO and tough job. 4 years, you're in a fishbowl. You got a lot of pressure on you. It's not just combat operations, the Red Sea. It's going to the Hill and trying to make all those folks happy. How much authority, Jim, does the CNO really have in the budget?
Yeah, so the Navy's got a $200 billion a year budget now, and the CNO gives the direction that shapes how that budget's going to be built, and gives the priorities for building the budget. Now, those are going to get reviewed and second guessed and tested as you go through OSD and the Congress and the rest, all that. But the initial budget that the Navy submits to OSD reflects the CNO's priorities. And so the big chunks, the number of aircraft carriers, what years are you buying them, the number of air wings you're buying and supporting, the number of submarines you're buying, the things that make up large chunks of money in the Navy's budget, the CNO has a direct impact on, because they review that stuff. There's a line in the budget, just because I know it, but the things less than $5 million. Okay, there's 1,000 things in that line. The line's worth probably $500 million a year.
Huh. Wow.
Does the CNO really look at that? Probably not. The detail underneath that makes that up, just because it's a lot of very small stuff, just adds up to a lot of money. But by setting the priorities, that translates in the budget process to, if it's not a priority, then it can be a bill payer. And that affects the balance of people, things, and readiness accounts. I've seen CNOs that were focused solely on readiness, which is fine, but it gets out of balance then because you're not recapitalizing what you've got. I've seen CNOs, their secretaries and CNOs that were focused solely on recapitalization. Okay, that's fine, but you do that by paying for it with readiness and taking risk in the force you have today. And certain CNOs were better at keeping the balance between people, readiness, and recapitalization, so that what you had stayed modern, stayed capable, but you were also thinking about what you were going to need next.
Yeah, extremely well said, sir. Next question here, entitlements. So, a $200 billion budget, but you still have to pay for salaries, medical benefits, pensions, housing, commissaries, and other perks that are expected in order to bring the best quality people, not just in the Navy, but retain them. So what's the percentage of all that really comes out of our ability to buy ships?
Yeah, so let me answer the question a couple of ways. First, medical is in DHA now, and pensions are in the retired pay accrual. That comes off the top of the DoD's budget. So by the time the service gets their part, those things are all taken care of already. But they're not insignificant bills. And I think that's changing a little bit too with, when you and I were junior officers, if we got out at 4 years, all the retired pay accrual that we had paid into, we got nothing out of that. That stayed in the account. Now with being able to transport pensions, the mechanics are changing in how the retired pay accrual has to work. So that's putting a burden on DoD. But let's talk about the part the Navy really has control over, and that's the salaries. Okay, and that is an entitlement. If you got the people there, you have to pay them. I never told anybody, but I would have worked for free. But as long as they let me go to sea and command a ship, I would have stayed. But the entitlements that you're getting, there's about $60 billion in manpower charges that the Navy has to pay, and that's largely paid. Some permanent change of station money, but so roughly, what is that? 23% or so of the budget,
Yeah,
goes to MILPER's pay, both reserve and active. The other component of that, and people don't think about this, roughly between a third and a half of the O&M account pays the civilian pay. And so that's another 40 billion on top of that. When you add the two together, half of your pay is, or half of your top line is going to civilian and military pay accounts just to pay for all the people you've got. Um, and so that's a significant impact. I see this all the time when we're talking to industry about, well, how much money has the Navy got? Well, it's $255 billion. Yeah, but that's not 255 billion of fungible assets, because there's so many things that are fenced or are entitlements or that sort of stuff that limit your ability to pay bills and buy new things.
Hey, thanks for that. And thanks for clarifying how we strip out Defense Health Agency and pensions. Obviously, it comes off the top line for DoD, so there's less that goes into total obligation authority for each of the services. Brings me to my next question. We define TOA, and we're kind of locked into. You and I talked about this in the Pentagon when I was on active duty a lot. Can we ever break the one-third, one-third, one-third paradigm? And we don't seem to be able to do that, even though right now the fight is in the maritime. I think this is the maritime century. I say that all the time. I quote Robert Kaplan in Asia's Cauldron on that all the time. So is it time to start apportioning a little bit more money to the United States Navy and Marine Corps? What do you think?
Yeah, somewhat parochially, I would answer, yeah, sure it is. Um, but first of all, the one third, one third, one third, the Army is always going to take exception with this. Um, it's a shorthand we use when we talk about how the money that's apportioned between the services goes out. Everybody forgets there's a defense-wide piece that's about 17% of DoD's TOA. Okay, 17% doesn't sound like a lot of money, but on an almost $1 trillion account, 17% is 170 billion. So it's not a trivial amount of money. The remainder of that is split relatively equally between the services. Navy and Air Force do get a little more than the Army does. What the Army always forgets is Navy is two services. Air Force is now two services. So the fact that we have slightly more than the Army does is a function of the fact that we're funding both a Navy and a Marine Corps, or a Space Force and an Air Force. What I've seen in the last 3 or 4 years, as DoD money gets apportioned at the service level, it's not that they've taken any money away from the Army, but they don't give the Army as much of the plus up as they give to the Air Force and Navy, which is very slowly shifting that paradigm. But as a practical matter, you can't ignore the Army. Even in a Pacific fight, they're responsible for base defense. And you and I've talked about this before. The likelihood that a China fight is just going to be about Taiwan, sort of round up to zero. So the Army is going to have a role in an Indo-PACOM dust up over Taiwan, because the Chinese are going to make it that way. So I think we need to be careful about how much we change that spread, because if we make the Army incapable of doing their mission, then we're going to do that at our peril.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I subscribe to that. And I am a joint warfighter. I mean, many of my jobs as a flag officer were in joint billets. In fact, probably all of them. And I understand the Army has grown from, 25,000 out in the Western Pacific to 125,000 with a 4-star command under Indo-PACOM. And so they have an important role out there. Let's shift gears and talk about the continuing resolution, that evil 2 words that crops up every year. It seems to be an easy way for politicians to kind of put things off. I mean, when continuing resolutions come in, you're not allowed to start any new programs. But I'm not an expert, and I wonder if you would just articulate for our audience what's bad about what is it, and what's bad about a continuing resolution?
Sure. If you don't have an appropriation to start the fiscal year, basically you go to a lapsed appropriation, which is a government shutdown for all intents and purposes. So the CR allowed you to take last year's budget and extend its life into the new year to allow operations to continue and for the government to function while you work out whatever the budget's going to be. And there's three fundamental constraints that I think are critical about a CR. While you're under a CR, as you mentioned, there's no new starts. So if you'd planned to go from RDT&E to procurement for a program you were already developing in RDT&E, you cannot, because you're shifting over to a different appropriation from research and development over to procurement. And that constitutes a new start. So those kinds of transitions get held up, slowed down, which it costs money. You can't make any ramp rate changes. So if you just started a program last year and this year you're trying to ramp up to full rate production, you can't. You're stuck at the low rate you were at the year before. And those are the two that everybody talks about all the time because they're the ones that most critically impact industry. The third issue that you have to deal with while you're under a CR, and I think this frankly is the most difficult part. The CR is based on the previous year's budget. And it extends everything that's in the previous year budget into the new year, assuming that you're doing exactly the same things this year as you were doing last year. So the easy example is if I bought an aircraft carrier last year, when the CR rolls out, it rolls a new aircraft carrier out in that new year. But I'm not building an aircraft carrier in that second year. So all that money that's trapped in the shipbuilding account for the carrier can't be moved, can't be used. And the inability to reprogram resources while you're under a CR and to get the pots right underneath the top line, that's the thing that's most difficult to manage at a CR from my perspective. You've got the money, essentially the same amount you had last year, but you got bunches of it that are locked in procurement accounts or operating accounts that are out of line with where you were planning to take that account. And because you can have these big procurements tied up and no ability to reprogram, you're short somewhere else. So, at the early part of a CR, it's difficult. The longer the CR goes, the more critical it becomes because you start to run out of money in these accounts that didn't get the money they were supposed to get. And yet you've got money tied up, you just can't get to it. So, that's the frustration. The last issue, and it really, it's not as much of a challenge as some of the other things, but when they finally passed the budget, all the contracting that was supposed to be happening in this case, we're talking about March before we see a budget. You've got 6 months worth of contracts that haven't taken place because you were under the CR and you couldn't write it in a contract. Now you need to take a year's worth of contracts and write those in that last 6 months. The opportunity for error.
Yeah.
The opportunity for an inability to get there, to get the contract done, goes up dramatically when you're trying to cram it all into a 6-month period. And you don't have any extra contracting officers to deal with that burden that's going to come once you get a budget.
Yeah, and those contracting officers, once they get really, really good, industry will snap them up and take.
Oh, absolutely.
A lot of frustrations there, Jim, and I have to compliment you on how well you explained that for just not only myself, but there's a lot of folks that really don't understand the significant impacts of the continuing resolution. The other thing is the vernacular is important, and you always break it down. We're talking about POMs, TOAs, PPBE, CRs, ramp rate increases. And so thanks for making that plain language in English so all of us can get it. Hey, let's shift over to the Marine Corps side. So, we talked about one-third, 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 and you're absolutely spot on. So the Space Force and the Air Force are now together and they're budgeting together. We have always been the quintessential joint warfighting team with our Marine Corps partners. I love the Marines. How much of the Navy budget goes to the Marine Corps, roughly?
Okay, so core budget, about 15% goes to the Marine Corps. The Navy gets the other 85%. That's called the blue-green split. And that money is only those things that the Marine Corps buys for themselves. So service unique.
Okay.
There's an additional part of the budget. It's called the blue in support of green, BSOG or BISOG, depending on when you learn the acronym. But that is the money the Navy has in their account to fund Marine Corps requirements that are common to Navy. And the most obvious example of this is if the Marine Corps stands up an airplane squadron, they have to buy the pilots. Those are Marines. The airplanes are bought by the Navy, and they're bought by the Navy under the contracts that we have with Boeing or Lockheed Martin to buy the aircraft that we're buying. So all the aircraft that gets procured for them, all the spare parts that get procured for them, all of the fuel that they use when they're flying, the Navy pays for all of that, and that's under the BISOG or BSOG. When you look at it with blue-green or the green dollars plus the BISOG, the Marine Corps is actually controlling about 25 or 30% of the Navy's the Department of Navy resources, and then the Navy's got the other 70% for what they do. Now, none of the BSOG goes to amphib ships. Amphib ships they belong to the Navy. The Navy mans them, staffs them, operates them. So they're Navy requirements, but the number of amphibs is driven by the Marine Corps demand signal. So that's an area where, and I think we'll probably talk about this in a minute or two, but that's an area of sometimes of contention between the Navy and the Marine Corps.
Yeah, I understand. And before we go to the amphibs, so as an example, with the MV2 Osprey, I've flown in that aircraft. I love that aircraft. I'm sad that it currently has a red stripe on it. We're trying to work through that. I think we're getting close. So the Navy bought those aircraft for the Marines to fly, particularly because we're using them or will be using them in lieu of CODs, carrier onboard delivery, the C2 Greyhounds. And we're still using the Greyhounds now while we work through the issue on the MV22. But that money didn't come out of that 15% that you originally mentioned.
No. As a matter of fact, the V22, the V22 took a long time to develop. A lot of arguments why, but where we are, the decision about bringing the V22s on for the Navy as the COD replacement started with a discussion I was having with Rooster Schmidl when he was Deputy Commandant for Aviation about how we could replace the CODs at a lower cost by leveraging the V22 capability. I think it's unfortunate that they have the red stripe on them as well. I think they're very capable aircraft. And I think it was probably the best choice for what we were going to do to replace it because it didn't require us to develop a brand new aircraft and do all the RDT&E associated with that, and likely have ended up someplace close to a V22 anyway.
Right.
So,
well, I think it's only a matter of time before the engineers work through that, and I look forward to seeing the MV22 flying safely again and embarking the carriers. Okay, let's talk about Commandant's guidance first, and then we'll go into amphibs. I think it lends itself to that. So, General Berger put out some Commandant's guidance in 2019. It was kind of revolutionary. It was very controversial. So he proposed and executed a divestment in M1 Abrams tanks for the Marine Corps, reduced artillery, then bought some back, changed the size of the air wings, and particularly the MV22s. He reduced end strength, and he invested in expeditionary advanced base operations and littoral operations with the Marine littoral regiments. Do you think, or what are you hearing about carryover of that guidance and that direction for the Marine Corps with the new Commandant in ACMAC, General Smith and Mahoney?
Yeah, so I think the only difference between the new Commandant and the last Commandant is the fact that instead of being Force Design 2030, it's Force Design. The General Berger's vision, and I know it was controversial, but he was the first commandant in my experience that really looked at how are we really going to fight the next war, and did an analytic approach to, if I'm not going to fight the way that we fought in the 50s, if we're going to fight a new way, then what does the Marine Corps have to look like in order to be able to execute in that manner for that new fight? So he lightened the Marine Corps up. They got rid of the M1A1s. Okay, everybody hated that, but those are really heavy tanks. He got rid of tube artillery and shifted to rocket artillery, which has a longer range, has more, more ability to have precision. So, from my perspective, it was kind of a breath of fresh air. There was, there probably is still some pushback in the Marine Corps and perhaps in the retired flag circles that, you have to have that massive Marine Corps capability, if for no other reason than deterrence. And I get it. But at the end of the day, there's a finite number of amphibs we can produce. So there's only so much lift you can have. And as things get bigger and heavier, the amount of stuff you can lift and bring to the beach quickly starts to drop off. So if you want to be able to do some kind of an amphibious operation, the Marine Corps has been saying this for 20 years, they needed to get lighter. They just never did anything about it until Berger came in. General Smith, he was brought in by Berger to become the cheerleader for that and to carry on that force design vision. And, it was telling in my view that once he became commandant, once General Smith did, it wasn't Force Design 2030 anymore. It's Force Design. This is where we're going forever.
Yeah.
So that, so I think that the Marine Corps is solidly going down the path of Marine Corps Force Design. And I think it's the right place to be going down.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the Marines under General Berger and now General Smith are willing to take some risk. They're doing a lot of experimentation. Expeditionary Advanced Base Operations was a big part of large-scale Exercise 23, which I participated in down in Norfolk. And, every once in a while, maybe once in a lifetime, some guy comes along like, Major Ellis, the guy in World War II that was the architect of the island hopping campaign in the war with Imperial Japan and makes a real difference. And we've got to think out of the box. And I think that's what the last commandant and this commandant are doing, and I laud them for that. Okay, so amphibs. It's been another hot item, for debate. 31 amphibs. They're expensive. You and I were talking earlier, $3 billion in some cases, big decks, maybe up to $5 billion. Magnificent ships. I used them all the time. Baltops 15, 16, Trident Juncture. Can't get enough of amphibious warfare and coined the phrase amphibiosity while we're doing things in the fjords in Norway. It's really important, particularly with what's going on with Russia right now. So, I think we've kind of coalesced, at least the Navy and Marine Corps have. I'm not sure, the Hill has on 31 amphibs. But the Marine Corps also wants what they used to call the light amphibious warship or landing ship medium. And they want another 35 of those so they can be part of this expeditionary advanced base operations in the Pacific. Is that, in your mind, is that realistic? Can we afford both? And if not, what are the trade-offs there? And I also want to mix in with this question the subject of the Naval Board. I'm not sure that our listeners understand what that is. That's something I got involved in as the Director of Navy Staff. You counseled me on how to do this. The Naval Board is a meeting of the senior leaders of the Navy and the Marine Corps inside the Pentagon, where the two directors of staffs get together. They bring in the subject matter experts to talk about something like this. Hey, what's the number? Is it 31, 38, or 25 regarding amphibs? And then the ACMAC and the vice chief meet and they nug it out. So we get to some kind of a conclusion, some kind of an agreement, and then invite in the service chiefs, the commandant, and the CNO. In my time, that seemed to work really well. Do you see the Naval Board as still being relevant today, and is it helping?
Yeah, so let's answer the question on light amphibious versus amphibs first, if I can tackle that one. So the Navy would love to build light amphibious warships because they're much cheaper than conventional amphibs are. But the dilemma for the Navy is they have to look at the whole budget, not just the Marine Corps portion of the budget, and doing conventional amphibs and then adding on to that light amphibious warship, the overall expense for amphibs would go up. The Navy's vision is it needs to be, I'll call it net zero. I'm sure it's not exactly that, but these are either or, not both. And to get the numbers up on a cheaper platform like the light amphibious warship or landing ship medium under the new vernacular, that would be an easier path for the Navy to go down. I had, many discussions with my Marine contemporaries when I was 8B that, just cash in one of the aircraft carriers, you can buy all the amphibs you need. Yes, that's true. At $13 to $15 billion a copy, that'd go a long way to buying amphibs and small light amphibious warships. But then the question becomes, who's going to escort those ships into combat? And if I didn't buy the aircraft carriers, I didn't buy the destroyers, I didn't buy the things that give you the protection force for that, then what was the point? Because you won't put them into and that's the dilemma the Navy has. And this is where I think the Naval Board becomes a little problematic. The Naval Board was formed to solve these Navy Marine Corps joint issues. But there's a tendency to do that in isolation of what are we talking about that means something to the Marine Corps. So, you don't talk about where does the money come from if you decide you want to do 31 amphibs plus 35 law. If that's the agreement and everybody walks out of the room with their, high-fiving each other, now you got to figure out how you're going to pay for it and where does the money come from to do that. And that's not typically part of the Naval Board's discussion. So, when the vice chief says, "Hey, we agreed, go do this," he's not going to like the offsets. And I think as the Navy's financial position has gotten more and more difficult, and this is true of all the services with the top lines not keeping up with inflation for the last several years, as the financial pressures have gotten harder on the Navy, they've become less flexible with, okay, we can do that too. And I think that's really where the nexus of the problem is. And I don't have the money to do it.
Yeah.
So I don't know that the Naval Board can solve that problem.
Great point, Jim. And to tell you the truth, having teed things up for the Naval Board, it really just hit me that you're right. I mean, the bottom line number was not part of that discussion. It was more on the capability or the platform. So thank you for clarifying that. As we move into our last question here, this is about the gold watch. That was the term of the day. And, we're going to talk about aircraft carriers. Can we still continue to afford 12 aircraft carriers? And of course, an aircraft carrier comes along with an air wing, 5,500 young men and women who are out there patriotically defending America on the pointy end of the spear. And it usually deploys with 5 surface ships, whether they're destroyers or cruisers, and soon to be our new frigate. I have to say the value in the carrier, I am a believer. I love the carriers. I love the fact that while I was 6th Fleet Commander or Naval Forces Europe, Commander Naval Forces Europe, I had a carrier come through. Harry S. Truman was with me throughout Trident Juncture and entire deployment. And while I was over at the State Department a couple of months ago, I was talking to Ambassador Jim Jeffries, who's a great friend of mine. He's an Army officer. He was a Deputy National Security Advisor for President Obama, became the ambassador to Turkey. And he walked over and he said, Admiral, you got to tell your friends in the Navy, I said, great job on getting the carriers over to the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, after the crisis on October 7th between Hamas and Israel, because I really think it prevented an extension of the conflict into, presumably, he was talking about Lebanon and Hezbollah. And even though there's tension on that border, Hezbollah has not entered into a full-blown war with Israel, and that's a good thing. There's now kind of a indication in the press that Iran may be getting a little bit of cold feet here in their sponsorship of the Houthis, because they see some strategic and tactical things that are near and dear to the Iranians at risk. And I think they should be worried, because we still have that carrier strike group, and it's proved immensely powerful and immensely effective in taking out targets on the ground. Our sponsor puts out information on things like, I woke up this morning and found out that the Houthis, which is the main focus of the action right now, just downed one of our MQ-9s. Just a couple hours ago, the UK Maritime Trade Organization said another ship was attacked. And, First Alert reported yesterday about an underwater drone. That's new, and that's something we haven't faced before. So having that capability out there is really important. I've written about this. When a crisis happens, president wakes up, first thing he says are, where are the carriers? But they're expensive. So Ford came in at about $13 billion. She had a magnificent deployment. In my humble opinion, outperformed previous Nimitz-class destroyers with all of her new modifications and things. But can we continue to afford that in the future budget process?
I appreciate the question. And, it's a very important question in terms of, you have to look at the combat capability that the carrier gives you, to your point. That's what you were just talking about. And what is the cost of not having it? A carrier is expensive. They're $13 billion now. But they're really, the cost of a carrier is a function of how many you're going to build. And I know that might be a little counterintuitive, but the more of them that you build, the closer the centers have to be in order to be able to keep the industrial base going. And as those centers get closer together, in other words, the build years get closer together, the more level the loading is at the shipyard, and then the price starts coming down as opposed to going up per ship. Because these are all really one-ofs. Every ship is a unique build because they're 5 years apart. On top of the aircraft carrier, you've got 44 strike fighters on the flight deck. That's $5 billion worth of aircraft. Then, you've got the carrier, or the 5 DDGs. That's about $13 billion when you add all that together. And then, the submarine that's with them, and everybody forgets about submarine because you never see it. Submarine's another, $3 billion. And then, there's about 6,000 people tied up in all those different ships and airplanes and squadrons and the rest of that. So, that's another $6 billion annually just to pay the people. So it's an expensive proposition to have a carrier strike group anywhere. To your point you made earlier, what would have happened if we hadn't been able to send carriers into the Western or the Eastern Med? I mean, if the Hezbollah had energized and spread the conflict that you had, that was the Hamas and Israel, and suddenly became Lebanon, Palestine, and Israel, and then that became the contagion or the conflagration in the Middle East that brings world oil supply to its knees. So what are you willing to pay to prevent that from happening? You have to ask yourself, I think, instead of how much they cost, it's what's the implication of not having this kind of capability to deter and limit spreads of these kinds of conflicts. So if this was 1941 and we were talking about changing over from the battleship navy to the carrier navy, because it was the future. What do you replace the carrier with that's the future conflict? Is it maybe there's something out there? Unmanned systems, satellite warfare, you can imagine anything, but until you prove that that works, you got to keep what does work. And that's aircraft carriers and carrier strike groups, along with their air wing that provide the offensive power that's the real deterrent to everybody. So I think looking at this in terms of what a carrier costs, I'll use the example Brendan McLean used at Surface Navy Association when somebody asked him about using $2 million missiles to shoot down a $2,000 drone, and his response was, "It's not how much the drone cost; it's how much damage the drone would have cost if it got to its target." And the same argument is true for the carriers. What would the cost have been had the carrier not been able to be there? And the ability to put carriers on station is what prevents these things from getting worse.
Jim, as a former nuke and as a surface warfare officer, what a great testimonial to the return on investment of our magnificent aircraft carriers, and particularly the new Ford class carrier. Like I said, I'm a believer, and what you just said is exactly right. We're getting a return on investment out of that $13 billion, and there is no substitute for it. When I think about what you said, well, if there is something out there in the future that could potentially take the place of an aircraft carrier, I don't think I know what it is. And I used to work for General Myers when I was in J5 on the Joint Staff. He was an Air Force general, and he was asked all the time about Rumsfeld's revolution in military affairs and transformation. He was asked by the press to define it, and he said, well, it's kind of like wing walking in the flying circus. And I loved it when he would talk about this. He goes, before you reach out and grab that next strut, you better not let go of the firm hand that you have on the last one. So let's make darn sure that we know where we're going before we decide a different way. The other thing about the aircraft carriers is that, you're right, block buys. Return money to the taxpayer. We get more for less. I've been down to Newport News Shipbuilding, and I've seen the Enterprise, the new Enterprise and the old Enterprise. What a contrast. And we're probably 30% done with the new Enterprise and dock down there. We've got John F. Kennedy's in the water. She was launching shapes into the James River a couple of weeks ago. And Dory Miller is on the way. CVN 81, my class from the Naval Academy. And I tell you what, I'm looking forward to the launch of that ship. Last thing I would say is, the carriers are like nothing else in our inventory or anybody else's inventory. And that's why the Chinese want them too, because we have them and we know how to operate them. And we've got, 100 years of carrier aviation plus and experience and doing what we're doing. So to your point, those magnificent ships being on station out there, whether it's in the Middle East, the Eastern Med, or the Western Pacific, are an amazing deterrent force. It's like an SSBN. They prevent wars, and wars cost a lot more money than the cost of that platform. So I think it's a great investment. So thanks for that. I said last thing, but I want to talk about, my alma mater, the Submarine Force. Right now, we're having some challenges in the shipyards. We've got about 40% of our boats hung up in the yards. Do you have an idea what should that number be, and why is it so high?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things driving that. Again, it's some of it's the short-sighted decision making we had a decade ago when we were talking about fielding the Virginia class, and we were building one a year, and we wanted two ships for $2 billion a piece by 12. And I was part of that fight to get there. And we did a lot of stuff to the Virginia class to take cost out. And now as we're trying to do the maintenance on those boats, as they're coming into their maintenance availabilities, we're finding that a lot of the decisions we made make it harder to do maintenance. It takes longer to do it. We've also spent, 20 years of operating, pushing what we had forward, getting it into theater. So we've used up a lot of service life on the ship. So not surprising when you bring them in, they have a lot more maintenance than perhaps they would have 20 years ago, just because of the demands that we're putting on them. Add on top of that, a workforce problem in the industry, in the shipbuilding industry. And if you want to put people at Portsmouth, you're hiring them away from EB. If you want to put a submarine in Norfolk Naval, you're hiring them away from HII in Norfolk. So, you've got this, do I want the new ships to deliver on time, or do I want the maintainable ships to deliver on time? Neither one of those is the right answer. I've got to do the best I can with the workforce I've got. And it takes a long time to build nuclear capable workforces. So it's a most acute problem in aircraft carriers and submarines. Aircraft carriers less so, I think, because a lot of the maintenance on the aircraft carriers, you don't have to worry about things like subsafe. On submarines, you do. So even the non-primary maintenance is at a higher standard than it is elsewhere. So what we'd like is no more than a third of the submarine fleet held up in yards at any one time, either on long-term availabilities or these short-term CNO availabilities, so that 2/3 of them are available to support the rotational base for the ships to be out there. And then you need the dry dock capacity, and you need the refueling capacity for not the Virginias, but for the Ohio class or the LA class boats. I think we're through that now on the LA class boats. I think they've all been refueled, the ones that are going to be refueled. But as you put more and more ships into the maintenance structure, you stress the availability of maintenance facilities and dry docks and so forth, and you end up with things like Boise that's been waiting to get into maintenance for 5 years. That's 2 crews worth of turnover.
Yeah.
And you haven't gotten any operational availability out of that ship at all. So yes, it's on the books. Yes, it's a submarine, and we're paying for crew and maintenance and support and the rest of all that, but it's not doing anything. We need to build the infrastructure up to support the maintenance requirement that we know we've got. And I think that's where we're having problems. I'm not sure what the solution to the lack of workforce is going to be. That's a much tougher problem than any of the rest of this.
Yeah. Well, the finite number of yards is a challenge, as you know, too. I mean, that's what's driving some of this. Great book, Freedom's Forge. I think you've read it. At the end of World War II, we had 55 yards, East Coast, West Coast, Gulf Coast. When Reagan and Weinberger came in during the Reagan administration, we had 19 shipyards, and today we have 7. So that's putting incredible pressure on our industrial base. We have, for the public yards, the Shipyard Integrated Optimization Plan, SIOP, doing some good work. There was a couple of notes in the press about overhauling the dry dock in Hawaii, well overdue. The dry dock down in Norfolk was built during the Civil War, so it's in need of modernization. We've done Portsmouth, and I think the delegation up in Maine are pretty happy with that. But we need to do more. I think the submarine industrial base is having some success in getting builders into the yards. I've certainly seen the advertisements during the Army-Navy game, and if you ever go up to Newport, Rhode Island, and T.F. Green Airport, there's some, majestic displays on be a builder and come aboard our team. And I fully subscribe to that. It's a great career for a young person who decides they'd prefer to go in the trades instead of going to college and incur a lot of debt. There's a number out there being bandied about in the budget process, and that is 2.33 plus 1 regarding the submarine force and how we support our own needs with the Virginia class and the needs of AUKUS. I think AUKUS is great, but can you explain to the audience what 2.33 plus 1 is?
Yeah, so what you're looking at is what the sustaining rate for the attack submarines has to be, which for the U.S. Navy is 2 year with a 33 year service life. That's 66 boats. So if you're building them at two a year, you'll sustain an inventory of 66. So that's sort of the baseline for attack submarines. In addition to that, you have to recapitalize the strategic missile boats. That's the plus one. So for the next decade, we need to do two Virginia class a year if you want to have 66 attack submarines, plus one boomer every year, so that you have the right number of SSBNs, which is 12 for now. The 0.33 for the 2.33 is the AUKUS the portion of the attack boat production line. The U.S. needs to have its two a year, and then the agreement that we're trying to put in place with the Australians is to build about a third of a submarine a year for them. So about every third year, you add a third submarine in. And that gives you the rate that the Australians need. And when you put that math together, that's 2.33 plus one.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. That's on the AUKUS side, Pillar 1, which is get them somewhere between 3 and 5 Virginia class submarines to start, and then they build this, indigenous submarine with the UK later on. I think that's a huge force multiplier for us, and I think it's well worth it. And that's why we have a submarine industrial base, this new acronym, the SIB, and why we're hiring. Great for the job market, which is really hot right now, and it's going to stay that way. On the one for the Columbia, foot stomp and endorsement there. Columbia, Trident is and Columbia will be the most secure portion of the triad. As things get tougher in the electromagnetic spectrum, I worry about bombers. I worry about missiles. Missiles are certainly having their problems and lack of recapitalization now. So I take solace in the fact that we're going to build this magnificent platform that's bigger than any other submarine out there that will have a life cycle of 42 years. And Jim, as a nuke, you can appreciate no refueling overhaul during that time frame.
Yeah.
I think the Navy is anticipating 124 strategic ballistic missile submarine patrols. I did 5 on USS MG Vallejo. It's one of the oldest platforms out there. She was a 30-year-old boomer, one of the 41 for freedom. I can't wait to see the Columbia, and I hope I get a chance to walk on board sometime. Well, sir, it's been an incredible journey with you. You have defined for us the terms, the POM, how it works, the challenges, the trade-offs, the continuing resolutions, and I really appreciate your time. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed doing this.
Thanks. And folks, that's a wrap. Thank you to Mr. Jim McCarthy for joining the Maritime Nation. I'd like to thank our listeners for joining us each month. If you have not heard our previous episode, you can always catch up on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts. Episodes and all content described here can be found on our new website, www.centerformaritimestrategy.org, all lowercase. And thank you to Data Miner for their sponsorship and support. Thank you to our sound engineer, James Peterson, for setting us up for success today. See you next time.